oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Invoked the Emergencies Act. 24 hours in, and there are more questions than answers. Questions about whether this is justified, questions around if the criteria is met, questions around what this means to Canadians' rights and freedoms. Parliamentary approval is required in order for the Prime Minister to use this unprecedented sledgehammer. So, can the Prime Minister tell us, when will Parliament be debating this? Will it be coming to us on Friday? And does he expect that we will look at it Friday, but then rise, take a week off, and not actually deal with this until March?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after discussions with Cabinet and caucus, after consultations with the premiers of all provinces and territories, after conversation with opposition leaders, we decided to invoke the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The scope of these measures are time-limited and geographically targeted. They are reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address, and they are fully to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to reassure all Canadians that this is the right thing to move forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I had a very simple question to the Prime Minister he was not able to answer. It would appear this could be more political drama for the Prime Minister. He name-calls people that he disagrees with. He wedges, he divides, he stigmatizes. Yet in spite of all of his failure, Coote's border has cleared. Windsor has opened up. Provinces and police are doing their jobs, and blockades are starting to come down. But the Prime Minister thinks that now is the time to use this extreme measure and invoke the Emergencies Act. Isn't it true that the Prime Minister's actions could serve to actually make things worse and not make things better?
Exactly. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting their communities and neighbourhoods, and ensuring jobs and our economy.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'm trying to hear the answer, and I'm having a very difficult time. There's some shouting going on. I'm going to have to ask the honourable members, maybe just keep it down. And if you've got something that you're not agreeing with, talk amongst yourself with someone next to you. You don't have to shout it out to the person across the floor. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you are absolutely right. This is a time for responsible leadership, not crass partisanship. The situation requires additional tools not held by other federal, provincial, or territorial law. It's what responsible leadership requires. These measures must be and will be compliant with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We will always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades need to end, and unfortunately, Conservative politicians continue to encourage the leaders of these blockades.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Well, let's get down to the basics of what this is really about. This is about the Prime Minister's ideological attachment to keeping COVID restrictions and mandates. 63% of Canadians want the restrictions and mandates to end. Conservatives presented a motion yesterday asking simply for a plan, but the Prime Minister is in denial and is ignoring the science. He might as well be back at the cottage because he's doing nothing productive or constructive to help this situation. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians when he will end the divisive, outdated, and unscientific mandate and restrictions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, this is a time for responsible leadership to end these blockades. Unfortunately, the Conservatives continue to play partisan games. The Conservative member of Provencher just yesterday...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off the Prime Minister just for a second. And just... I mean, heckling is usually throwing one comment out. Clever, hopefully, although not always necessary. But what I'm hearing is someone bullying and trying to drown someone out. That's not heckling. I just want everyone to take a deep breath, and I'll let the Prime Minister start from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we see that even in a moment of extremely challenging times, when people are moving forward with responsible leadership and responsible tools, the Conservatives can't help themselves but play crass political games and divide. The Conservative member for Provencher just yesterday embraced the leaders of this blockade and amplified their cause. The Conservative member for Yorkton-Melville said this weekend that blockaders who ripped down fencing around our national war memorial are patriots. The Conservative leadership contender from Carleton continues to say he's proud.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Pendant 17 jours, le premier ministre n'a pas levé le petit doigt sur ce qui se passait ici à Ottawa. Plus tôt, il a insulté les gens qui ne l'écoutaient pas, qui ne partageaient pas son point de vue. Résultat, M. le Président, hier, le premier ministre a sorti une loi qu'on n'a pas utilisée pendant un demi-siècle. Il affirme avoir consulté les premiers ministres. C'est faux. Il a plutôt informé les premiers ministres, puisque plus de la moitié des premiers ministres provinciaux sont contre. Le premier ministre le voit très bien dit en disant que le premier ministre canadien jette de l'huile sur le feu. Pourquoi le premier ministre agit toujours pour camoufler son inaction?
Why does the Prime Minister always try to cover up his inaction in this way?
Depuis le début, nous étions en train de travailler de façon responsable avec les autorités locales, avec les différentes juridictions pour contrer ces barrages illégaux. Et nous allons continuer d'assurer que les polices locales aient tous les outils nécessaires. Et c'est exactement ce qu'on a amené hier, des outils additionnels que la police locale, plus de juridictions locales peut utiliser en cas de barricades et de blocages. Je sais malheureusement que les politiciens conservateurs tendent à appuyer ceux qui barricadent notre économie et nos communautés. Nous connaissons d'autres.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, tous les Canadiens ont constaté qu'au cours des jours derniers, il y a des situations qui se sont améliorées sans avoir à utiliser la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Ça s'est passé en Ontario, ça s'est passé en Alberta, et ça aurait pu se passer ici à Ottawa. Mais non, Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre préfère chercher une loi qu'on n'a pas utilisée pendant un demi-siècle, continuer à stigmatiser, à diviser et à insulter ceux qui pensent contraire, plutôt que de chercher le compromis. Pourquoi le Premier ministre refuse d'écouter les Canadiens qui veulent un Premier ministre qui rassemble, comme le pense d'ailleurs son député libéral de Louis Hébert?
Including his own member from Louis Hébert. The Honourable Prime Minister.
Les Canadiens sont
Mr.
tannés
Speaker,
de la COVID. Ils sont tannés des restrictions. Ils sont aussi tannés que les gens barricadent
but they're
leur
also
rue
tired of
et
people
bloquent
blocking
leur
their
accès
streets
aux biens et à
and
leurs
impeding
emplois.
their
C'est pour ça
access
que nous avons
to
dû prendre des mesures
goods and services. And that's why we've had to take responsible steps to allow the provinces and local jurisdictions to maintain supply chains and keep our streets clear of illegal demonstrations. We will always be there to support our police forces with the tools that are charter consistent and to protect our values and rights.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Chambly.
Ottawa a perdu le contrôle sur Ottawa.
Mr.
Pourtant,
Speaker, Ottawa
la
has lost
situation
control
au port des
over
ambassadeurs
Ottawa.
a été réglée sans la loi sur les mesures d'urgence.
Ambassador
La
Bridge
situation à
situation
Cass et la
was
Saint-Dame s'est
solved
faite
without
sans la loi
the
sur les mesures
Emergencies
d'urgence.
Act.
La situation au Québec a
The
été très bien
situation
gérée
in
sans
Quebec
la loi
was
sur les mesures
managed
d'urgence.
very well without the
Le
Emergencies
premier ministre a
Act.
pris un engagement hier à
The Prime
circonscrire
Minister
géographiquement
made a
les
commitment to
interventions
limit the
en vertu du
geographic
décret.
use
Or, le décret,
of
il
the
dit pas ça,
Emergencies Act.
pantoute.
But
Est-ce que le
the
premier
actual
ministre
order doesn't say
s'engage
that
à
at all.
soustraire
Will the Prime
expressément
Minister
le Québec de
promise to
l'application de son
explicitly exclude
décret?
Quebec from the application of this emergency order?
Président,
The Honourable
la
Prime
loi sur les
Minister.
mesures
Mr.
d'urgence
Speaker,
donne
the
des
Emergencies
outils
Act
additionnels
gives
aux
additional
policiers
tools
à
to
travers le
police
pays
forces
en
all
cas de
across the
situation
country
d'urgence, comme
in
on a
an
vu un
emergency
peu partout au
situation,
pays.
as we've seen all over the
Dans bien
country,
des
more
endroits
or
au
less,
pays,
and in many
ils ont pu
places,
bien gérer
they
ces
have managed
barricades,
to deal
mais
with
on
these
sait que les
barricades,
risques demeurent
but we
et
know
donc
that the risk
la
remains
police de juridiction
a
locale
fact,
au Québec
and
et
it's
ailleurs
up to local
vont
police
avoir
in
des
Quebec
outils
or elsewhere.
supplémentaires
They will
s'ils
have
en
the tools
ont
available
besoin,
to them if
Monsieur
they
le
need
Président.
them, Mr.
C'est
Speaker.
des mesures
Those
proportionnées,
measures are
responsables,
proportionate,
qui vont
they're
s'appliquer seulement en
responsible,
cas de besoin
and they will
par
only
la
be
police
used
locale.
if needed by
député de
local
Belleuil
police.
Chambly.
The honourable member for
Monsieur le
Belleuil-Chambly.
Président, les
Mr.
partis
Speaker,
à l'Assemblée nationale du
The
Québec
parties at
n'en
the
veulent
National
pas.
Assembly in Quebec
Le
aren't
gouvernement du
interested.
Québec
The government
n'en
of
veut
Quebec is not
Le
interested.
Bloc québécois
The
n'en
Bloc
veut
québécois
pas.
is not
J'entends dans
interested
les
either.
banquettes voisines
And
que
I
les gens de
hear
l'Alberta n'en veulent pas, de
among
la
our neighbors
Saskatchewan
that
n'en
Alberta is
veulent
not
pas,
interested,
Manitoba n'en
Saskatchewan's
veulent
not
pas.
interested, Manitoba's
Est-ce
not
que le premier
interested.
ministre se magasine son moment
Is
Just
the
Watch Me
Prime
en
Minister
imposant une loi
shopping
au Québec
around?
contre le Québec?
Does he really want?
Très
Is he looking for
honorable
support to
Premier
impose
Ministre.
legislation in Quebec against
Cette
Quebec's
loi sur
will?
les mesures
The Honourable
d'urgence
Prime Minister.
s'applique
Mr. Speaker,
contre
the
les
Emergencies
barricades
Act
illégales,
applies
les
against
occupations
illegal
illégales qui se
barricades
trouvent
and
à
blockades
surgir ici et là
that may
partout au
crop up
pays.
here and
C'est
there all
c'est une
around
réponse
the
que nous
country.
avons mis
This
de l'avant,
is a
qui est
response
responsable,
that we
qui
have
est
come up with.
proportionnée,
It's
qui est
responsible,
limitée
it's
et dans le temps
proportionate, and
et
it's
dans
limited
son
both in
application
time
géographique
and
et
in its geographic
qui
application.
est toujours en train de protéger les valeurs et
And
les
it
libertés
still
à l'intérieur de la
protects
Charte
our
des droits et
rights and
libertés.
freedoms under
Nous
the
sommes
Charter.
en train de réagir de
We
façon
are reacting
responsable et nous allons continuer
responsibly,
d'être là
and we
pour
will
les
continue
Canadiens
to be
qui
there
en souffrent.
for Canadians who are
Le
suffering.
député de Burnaby
The honourable member for
Sud.
Burnaby South.
Sadly, we are in this crisis because we've seen a failure to take this crisis seriously at all levels of government. And now we're seeing Indigenous and racialized people look at the double standard that the convoy is being treated as compared to those protesters. And we also have deeply disturbing reports of military and police personnel who've expressed sympathy and support for the convoy. So will the Prime Minister provide assurances in this House that the police will use the powers given to protect people and not support the occupation?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the measured and responsible use of the Emergencies Act that we announced yesterday gives specific time-limited proportional tools to police of local jurisdiction and their partners to be able to ensure that these illegal blockades end, to make sure that people who have now fully been heard by all Canadians choose to go home. These are the things that Canadians expect from their orders of government, and I can say that we have worked extremely closely across orders of government with all different polices of jurisdiction to ensure that Canadians get their streets and their lives back.
Member for Burnaby South.
On est dans une crise nationale et
We're
on a
in
vu les
a
impacts de
national
cette
crisis,
crise. Des armes
and
étaient
we
trouvées
aren't
à
seeing the end
Coutts
of it yet.
et la situation
Weapons
s'empire
were
à
found
Ottawa.
in
Donc
Coutts,
c'est
and
bien
the
clair
situation
qu'on
is
doit
getting
mettre
worse
fin
in
à
Ottawa. So
l'occupation.
obviously, an end
Mais c'est
must
aussi
be
clair
put
qu'il n'y
to
a
this
pas
occupation.
d'occupation
But it's
au
also
Québec.
clear that
Donc,
there's no
le Premier
occupation
ministre, est-ce qu'il est
in
prêt de
Quebec.
s'engager
So is the
que
Prime
les
Minister
mesures
willing
d'urgence
to
ne
promise
vont pas être
that
appliquées
these emergency
où
measures
il
will
n'est
not be
pas
applied
nécessaire?
where they're not needed?
Très
The
honorable
Right Honourable Prime
Ministre.
Minister.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker,
cette loi sur les mesures d'urgence
the Emergencies
met de
Act
l'avant des outils supplémentaires
makes
pour les
extra tools
gouvernements locaux, pour
available to local
les
governments
policiers locaux,
and local
appuyés
police
par la
forces,
GRC en cas de
supported by the
besoin.
RCMP.
Nous n'allons pas
If
imposer
needed.
des mesures
We're not going
nulle
to
part au pays
impose
où ils ne sont pas
anything
besoins. C'est des
anywhere
outils que
where it's
la
not
police de
needed.
juridiction
These are
locale
simply tools
peut
that local
utiliser
police
ou non à
may
leur
or may
discrétion.
not
Mais c'est
use.
une
It's up
question
to them.
de s'assurer
It's a
que
matter of
nous avons
ensuring
tous les
that
outils
we have
nécessaires
all the
pour
tools
s'assurer
we need
que nous en
to
finissons
ensure
avec ces
that we
barricades
put an
illégales.
end to these illegal
Member
blockades.
for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, the invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history is a damning indictment on the failure of this Prime Minister to address the situation. The Prime Minister once said, I quote, "When a government asks its citizens to give up even a small portion of their liberty, it is not simply enough to say, trust us. That trust must be earned, it must be checked, and it must be renewed." These are his words. Canadians do not trust this Prime Minister. When will he stop undermining Canadians' rights and start renewing Canadians' trust?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust that this government will always follow the science and the best evidence to get us out of this pandemic, and that includes getting vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to what my colleague says, this is an illegal blockade. This illegal blockade is not about the vaccines or the mandates. It's about a very small, organized group who are trying to upend our way of life, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've made progress. We've seen the Ambassador Bridge reopened. We've seen Coutts reopened. We've seen Surrey reopened. And, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, yes, we invoked the Emergencies Act so so that we can secure that progress and give law enforcement all of the tools they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, we'll see if the Prime Minister answers this one. Every opportunity he has had to de-escalate this situation in Ottawa and around Canada, he has chosen to hide, to confront, and to escalate. His divisive conduct has been a lesson in abject failure. Blockades should come down. They are already coming down across this country. But now the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act to punish Canadians who, in his words, hold unacceptable views. Why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadians for their political views?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Ago that the former Conservative leader, now the member for Regina Capel with the Conservative Party, said the following: these protesters, these activists, may have the luxury of spending days at a time at a blockade, but they need to check their privilege. They need to check their privilege and let the people whose jobs depend on the railway system and small business and farmers do their jobs. And what have they said now in this context from the beginning? As swastikas flew, as Confederate flags flew, they went out and they gave coffee. They took pictures. They have absolutely the opposite of responsible leadership. Instead of de-escalating, they escalated at every turn.
Can we go on? L'honorable député de Portneuf, Jacques Cartier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous voulons tous dénouer l'impasse devant le Parlement ici à Ottawa et que ça finisse rapidement et pacifiquement. L'inaction de ce gouvernement les oblige à faire du rattrapage et imposer la loi des mesures d'urgence. Ils auraient avantage à s'inspirer des premiers ministres des provinces qui ont réussi, eux, à contrôler les manifestations sans loi spéciale. Est-ce que le Premier ministre s'engage à ne pas utiliser les pouvoirs des mesures d'urgence dans les nombreuses provinces qui s'y opposent?
C'était l'ancien chef du Parti conservateur, qui est le membre, le député aujourd'hui pour Regina Capel, qui a dit à ce moment-là que ce n'était pas acceptable d'avoir une manifestation qui bloque des infrastructures critiques. Et qu'est-ce que le Parti conservateur fait aujourd'hui? Le Parti conservateur aujourd'hui est là de prendre des photos, de tweets et d'encourager des manifestations. Quand le coût pour ça est le milliard de dollars, c'est pas responsable.
That's not responsible what they're doing. It's completely irresponsible.
Monsieur le Président, c'est le gouvernement qui est irresponsable. Je vais répéter ma question et j'invite le leader à écouter la question. L'île du Prince-Édouard, le Nouveau-Brunswick, l'Alberta, le Québec n'en veulent pas des mesures sanitaires. Quand le gouvernement doit s'engager à ne pas obliger les provinces à subir les mesures sanitaires.
Responsable. Chaque député te protège la loi, te protège les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. Ça, c'est une responsabilité pour chaque député. C'est pas juste le gouvernement de Canada. C'est pas juste cette côté de Chambre des communes. Et je veux dire clairement, c'est le temps d'arrêter de tweets et d'appuyer les personnes qui manifestent à l'extérieur.
Of people demonstrating outside.
C'est le temps de faire
it is
l'action
time
raisonnable
to take
et reasonable
steps, reasonable action, and it's time for the Conservative Party
act responsibly,
to
Mr.
act
Speaker.
responsibly.
The honourable member for Calgary Midnapore.
Are you done now? For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based.
I just want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the Speaker. I'll let her restart her question.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
From the top.
Again, my apologies. For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based on science. Canadians sacrificed, they isolated, closed businesses, got vaccinated because experts advised it was the safest way forward. Now, those same experts say it is time to ease restrictions. Premiers are listening, but this Prime Minister believes he knows better and has invoked the Emergency Measures Act. Does the Prime Minister intend to force provinces to implement measures they and science disagree with?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'll tell you what I'm done with. I'm done with seeing as this protest continues, as illegal actions continue that cost billions of dollars to businesses, that terrorize downtown residents. I am tired of seeing conservative tweets, such as the member from Bergen who's saying that he supports it, the member for Yorkton Melville saying that that ripping down barricades in front of a war memorial is a patriotic act, watching somebody who aspires to be leader of Conservative Party saying that what's happening outside is something he stands by. That is enough. Please, it's time to end this. Stop supporting what's going on outside.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, the rest of the world is opening up and returning to normal. Where the science supports it, provinces are providing Canadians with hope for the first time in 2 years, contrary to this Prime Minister, whose lack of leadership has brought him to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, traumatizing Canadians. He is well aware that many provinces are opposed to these measures. He is also well aware that the science says that they are not needed. Will this Prime Minister force provinces to implement measures that they had independently decided to remove?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has one of the lowest death rates in the world, one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. It has met the challenge of this pandemic. But what has not been met in this hour of history is that as the chaos descended outside, as protesters began to shut down critical infrastructure, we had lawmakers, people of this House, going out and encouraging their activity. And I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, if they didn't have lawmakers who were elected by constituents encouraging their illegal actions, when would this have been over? I think it would have been over a lot sooner.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamétis-Matane-Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre a déclaré hier que la loi sur les mesures d'urgence n'était pas quelque chose à prendre à la légère. Mais en effet, la loi n'a jamais été utilisée depuis son adoption en 1988. Cependant, Monsieur le Président, je n'étais même pas né. C'est le dernier des derniers recours.
It's really supposed to be the very last resort. The Prime Minister himself said it's not the first tool we've used, not even the second or third. Well, he didn't use a first tool, a second tool, or a third tool. He used zero tools before he came up with the most extreme option. Is that really reasonable?
Ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, je veux remercier ma collègue pour la question. C'est vrai qu'on avait fait beaucoup de progrès sur le terrain à la frontière à Surrey, à Coutts, même au Windsor, où maintenant le pont d'Ambassadeur est réouvert. C'est bon pour le commerce. Mais hier, on avait invoqué la loi sur les mesures d'urgence pour offrir des outils nouveaux et innovatifs pour aider les services de policiers pour terminer cette blocade illégale. Ça, c'est le focus de notre gouvernement. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
That is what a responsible government does. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member.
Monsieur le Président, je vais vous dire ce qu'a pas fait le gouvernement. Le Premier ministre n'est pas entré en communication
Prime
avec les
Minister
assiégeants du Parlement
did
depuis
not
19
get in
jours.
touch with the
Il n'a pas
people who
envoyé sa part
have
des
besieged
1800
Parliament
agents
for
des forces de
19
l'ordre
days
demandés
now.
par la ville
He
d'Ottawa.
didn't send
Il n'a
his
pas
share of
créé
the
une crise
1,800
à la fois
law
dans les
enforcement
palais du
officers
gouvernement et tous les
requested
corps
by
de
the
police.
city of
Il n'a pas
Ottawa.
consulté
He
ses
didn't
partenaires
create
du
a
Québec et
crisis
des
unit,
provinces avant de les informer
including
de
all
sa
governments and
décision
police forces.
d'utiliser la
He
loi sur
didn't
les mesures
consult his
d'urgence.
partners in
Le
Quebec
Premier
and the
ministre
provinces
croit-il
before
vraiment
informing
que
them
cette loi
of
va
his
être la
decision to
première
invoke the
action réelle du
Emergencies
gouvernement
Act?
pour
Does the
répondre au
Prime
siège
Minister
d'Ottawa?
believe that this legislation should really be the first step the government has taken in
Monsieur le Président,
response?
avec beaucoup de respect à ma collègue, peut-être
honourable
elle a
member.
manqué les nouvelles. Il y a
With
3
all due
installations de
respect,
services
perhaps
policiers pour
my
aider
colleague
les
hasn't
services
been
ici au
aware of the
Ottawa.
news. There have
Et
been
les
three
membres de la
installments
GRC
of
avaient fait beaucoup de bon
RCMP,
travail, pas seulement
being
au
loaned
Ottawa,
to local
mais au
police
Windsor, où
enforcement
maintenant le
in
pont
Ottawa
Ambassador
and in
est
Windsor, and now the
réouvert.
Ambassador
C'est bon
Bridge
pour
is open again.
l'économie, c'est bon
That's good for the
pour tout le
economy,
monde.
that's good for
Mais il
everyone.
faut aussi
So
d'explorer
we've
des
done a
nouveaux
lot.
outils
But
pour
we have
aider
to
les services
also consider
policiers pour terminer
further
cette
tools,
blocade
new
et
tools,
cette
to
convoi
help the
illégal.
police
Merci.
finally put an end to this
Député
illegal
d'Avignon-Lamétis
blockade. Thank you.
Matapédia.
The honourable
Monsieur
member.
le Président, le Premier ministre
Mr.
du Québec a
Speaker, the
été
Premier
clair.
of
Le
Quebec
Québec n'a
was
pas
clear.
besoin de la loi
Quebec
sur les
doesn't
mesures
need
d'urgence.
the
Le
Emergencies
gouvernement du
Act.
Québec en veut
The
pas.
government of Quebec
L'Assemblée
doesn't
nationale
want it.
s'oppose
The National
unanimement à ce que ce
Assembly is
décret s'applique au
unanimously
Québec.
opposed
Pourtant, le premier
to this
ministre
being
qui
used
hier
in
avait dit
Quebec.
que ce serait
But yesterday,
localisé
the Prime Minister
géographiquement,
said
arrive
it
avec
would
un
be
décret qui s'applique
geographically
partout au Canada,
limited.
incluant au
But the
Québec.
Order in Council
Pourquoi le premier
applies
ministre
all
qui
across
prétend
Canada,
consulter a-t-il
including
décidé
Quebec?
d'ignorer
Why is the Prime
encore une
Minister,
fois
who
la demande
claims
du
to be
Québec?
consulting,
Pourquoi
why
la
has he
loi sur les
decided
mesures
to
d'urgence
run roughshod over
s'applique-t-elle au
Quebec's
Québec?
request once again? Why should
L'honorable
this
ministre de la
law
Sécurité
apply in
publique.
Quebec?
Merci, Monsieur le
Honourable
Président. Je
Minister.
veux rassurer
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to
ma collègue
reassure my
qu'on va continuer d'offrir
we
des
are
ressources
going to
dans le
continue
contexte
to
des
offer
les autorités dans les lois.
resources.
Mais hier, on avait invoqué
Under this
les lois
act,
sur les
yesterday we
mesures
invoked
d'urgence.
the
Ces lois
Emergencies
est temporaire,
Act. It's
ce sont
temporary.
géographiques spécifiques
It's limited
et
in
les mesures
scope.
sont ciblées
And the
et
measures are
ces
targeted.
outils vont
This
être
tool
implémentés
will
en
be
concert
implemented
avec les
together
provinces et les
with the
territoires,
provinces and
même au Québec.
territories, even Quebec.
The honourable member for Peterborough Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday during a press conference, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Some people will say we moved too quickly. Other people will say, no, we should have acted weeks ago. The reality is this. The Emergencies Act is not something to take lightly. It is not the first thing you turn to, nor the second, nor the third. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister please tell Canadians what first, second, and third actions he took before invoking the emergency?
The honourable minister for emergency preparedness.
You know, right from the outset of the blockades and the disruptions that were taking place in Ottawa, and then the blockades at our critical infrastructure at our ports of entry, our government has worked with municipal and provincial partners right across the country in order to ensure that they had the resources and the support they needed to keep Canadians safe.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask the minister to repeat. I'm right next to you, or to the honourable member, and I can't hear it because of the shouting. If I can ask the honourable minister to start from the top so that at least I can hear it, and hopefully the honourable member for Peterborough Kawartha can hear the answer.
First, Mr. Speaker, I'm actually very glad to see that the Conservatives have once again changed their position on something important. Whereas first they supported these blockades, and now that they recognize that this is a largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on Canadian critical infrastructure, they flip-flop. Good for them. We're all getting used to it.
The member for Peterborough Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, I think the person or the party that has flip-flopped is the Liberals. Last week, you said you had all the tools you needed, they needed to do this. And now we have an Emergency Measures Act.
Yeah.
We were told we would never need federal vaccine mandates. That changed. Now you're saying it's just jurisdiction. How can we trust this government? How much authority does the Prime Minister need to set an unprecedented Emergency Measures Act? How much authority does he need?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, the evidence is clear. A largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on critical Canadian infrastructure at our borders is hurting Canada and harming Canadians. And, Mr. Speaker, it was equally clear that we needed to do more, and we would have to do what was required. Mr. Speaker, we've introduced measures that will create greater financial scrutiny and financial consequences for the people who are engaged in this criminal behavior. The evidence of firearms at Coots elevates the risk to Canadian security and safety, and we will do what is required to keep Canadians safe.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the Prime Minister said that the Ottawa Police had enough resources to deal with the protesters. That's right. And on Monday, he calls for emergency measures. Boy, that escalated quickly. He had 17 days to act, and after hiding at his cottage on his MacBook for the first week, he did nothing but divide and stigmatize. Mr. Speaker, the constituents in Saskatoon West want to know what changed in the Prime Minister's mind over the weekend to justify such drastic measures.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr.
Speaker, I want to assure my colleague that the RCMP has been supporting and aiding the Ottawa Police Service to enforce public safety, not only here in Ottawa, but in Windsor, where we've reopened the Ambassador Bridge, in Coots, where the border's reopened, in Surrey, where the border's reopened, and that's good. It's good for the economy. It's good for Canadians who can get back to work, Mr. Speaker. And yesterday's invocation of the Emergencies Act is meant to secure those gains so that we give the police all of the tools that they need, whether it's declaring certain zones which are adjacent to our borders, to our national symbols, Mr. Speaker. It's important for the Conservatives to ask those participating in the illegal blockades to now go home.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Mr. Speaker, for too long, Conservatives have been calling on this government to remove the mandatory PCR test requirements for those entering Canada. In my riding of Niagara Falls, this policy has had a devastating impact on our economy. Visits from the U.S. are nowhere near the record levels reached in 2019, and these expensive costs put on our visitors and Canadians traveling prevent them from visiting their families and loved ones. My residents want to know this: when will all federal travel mandates be ended?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for giving me the opportunity to share with him and all members of this House and all Canadians the great announcement that myself and our colleagues made today. Today, based on the science and the public health advice we received, we eased our travel measure, including, Mr. Speaker, allowing incoming travelers to use an antigen test instead of the PCR test, pre-departure test. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Unlawful blockades at the borders across the country, including Windsor and Coots, have been shown that the Liberals have not done the proper, serious work necessary to ensure that our borders are protected and the citizens that live nearby are safe. These illegal blockades have hurt every Canadian by hurting thousands of people from getting to work and supporting their families. We have long been calling for a safe border task force, reinstate cuts from the CBSA intelligence, and also to make sure that municipalities are reinstated for their costs. To the Prime Minister, will he finally listen to our calls to ensure that safe borders are going to happen, or he's going to continue to listen to extremists? The bridge might be open now, but the threat hasn't stopped. Will he act?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable colleague's concern, and I can inform the House that I've been in routine contact with him, as well as the municipal leaders in Windsor, including the Mayor of Windsor. And I've assured him and the government will continue to provide all of the resources that the community of Windsor needs to keep that bridge open. That means, yes, making sure that police have the assets that they need, be it tow trucks, be it barriers, be it whatever resources, so that we can keep the economy rolling, the bridge open, and get Canadians back to work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
And what about Alberta? You know, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the RCMP arrested 13 extremists blockading the border at Coots. They seized guns, ammunition, and body armor, including assault weapons with thousands of rounds. This comes after Convoy leaders raised millions from foreign donors with a stated goal to overthrow the government. And while I'm happy to see that the blockade appears to be ending in Alberta, the fact remains that we had an armed militia active in Alberta. This is unthinkable. Why did it take 18 days and proof of an armed threat to make the government act and protect Albertans and Canadians?
Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for that very important question, and I think it does reveal, and we agree, that what we have seen in Coots, Alberta, and in a number of these blockades, illegal blockades across the country, is that the threat is not yet gone. And that's precisely why, Mr. Speaker, we've introduced through these measures of the Emergency Act that we introduced yesterday that will increase, for example, the financial scrutiny and consequences of these illegal acts, that will also make available equipment and authorities that our law enforcement officials need to maintain and restore public safety and to protect Canada's interests.
Well, member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, since the Government of Canada announced its ambitious plan for a $10 a day early learning and childcare system across the country, we have signed agreements with 9 provinces and 3 territories. Already in some provinces, families are seeing a reduction in their childcare fees, making life more affordable. But those in my riding of Davenport in downtown West Toronto are wondering, when is Ontario going to sign on? And when will they too be able to benefit from our national childcare program? Can the share any updates on the federal government's efforts to reach a childcare agreement with Ontario?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from Davenport for that important question. We have now signed agreements with 12 provinces and territories across the country. That means that families from coast to coast to coast, except for in Ontario at this point in time, will have access to 50% reduction in fees by the end of this calendar year. Mr. Speaker, I remain very optimistic that we will sign an agreement with Ontario. There is a fair deal on the table, $10.2 billion that will go to helping families decrease the costs of childcare and make life more affordable.
Member for Abbotsford.
Well, Canadians are stressed. Paychecks don't buy what they used to. In fact, the cost of everything, gasoline, groceries, housing, is at all-time highs. Families are getting left behind. So last April, I wrote to the minister to warn her of exactly that. I highlighted the dangers of uncontrolled borrowing and how excessive stimulus spending would stoke inflationary pressures. She either doesn't care or didn't read my letter. So to the minister, what specifically is she doing to get inflation under control?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue, actually in all aspects of Canadian life, to put forward a false narrative. And the latest false narrative we've just been hearing today is about the economy. The reality is that the Canadian economy is recovering strongly from the COVID recession. In the third quarter, our GDP grew by 5.4%. That is higher than the US, Japan, the UK, and Australia. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? When it comes to our debt to GDP ratio, our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed in the fall by S&P and Moody's.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, we will never get inflation under control as long as that minister keeps borrowing and spending like there's no tomorrow. Not only did the minister ignore our concerns, she also ignored the warnings of the parliamentary budget officer, who questioned the wisdom of her stimulus spending, pumping more money into the economy when the cost of living is skyrocketing. This minister is making this crisis worse. This problem is not transitory. Month by month, the inflation numbers are going up. When will the minister finally do something to protect Canadians against the skyrocketing cost of living?
Right to the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the real question is, when will the Conservatives stick with a policy or stick with a leader? Because I was on the campaign trail in the summer, and so were the members opposite, and they actually campaigned on proposed government spending higher than our own proposal. We proposed a deficit for 21-22 of $156.9 billion. They campaigned on a proposed deficit of $168 billion. So I wonder if the party of flip-flops can tell Canadians where they stand today.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The excise escalator tax increase will crush wineries, breweries, cideries, and distilleries' bottom line. The excise escalator tax is automatic. And here's the kicker. It's based on the CPI index, meaning because inflation is so high, the tax will be even higher than ever before starting April 1st. This tax is based on inflation. It's taxing inflation, which will make inflation go up even more on these important value-added agricultural products. So will the Liberals commit to cancel this inflationary excise tax increase?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it is a bit rich of the Conservatives to be talking about supporting small businesses of any kind in this country. After all, Mr. Speaker, this is the party which, when we, before Christmas, proposed absolutely essential support for small business to help them get through Omicron, what did the Conservatives do at that crucial moment? They voted against our measures. So really, Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons about
about supporting business from them.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That wasn't an answer to my question at all. When Canadian winery, brewery, cidery, and distillery workers wake up and owners on April 1st, they'll be hit with this automatic tax increase on excise thanks to the Liberals. 95% of these producers are small businesses who have already been hit with payroll tax increases, labour shortages, increases in debt, and slower sales due to perpetual lockdowns. Now is not the time to be increasing any taxes on small businesses. So will the Liberals cancel this bad April Fool's Day tax increase?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what hurts Canadian small businesses. What hurts Canadian small businesses is solely for the sake of partisan posturing, people who were elected to this House to support the small businesses in their communities oppose the small business support that small businesses themselves are calling for. And you know what else has hurt Canadian businesses, small ones and big ones too? The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge. Exactly. And members on that side of the House were giving succor and encouragement to those blockades. That is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Montarville.
Monsieur le Président, c'est aujourd'hui, 15 février, le jour de l'unifolié. Le Canada célèbre son drapeau. Pour être célébré, Monsieur le Président, il est célébré. On le voit partout, plus que jamais, dans les rues du centre-ville d'Ottawa. Il flotte dans des manifestations aux États-Unis, en France, en Nouvelle-Zélande. Le drapeau canadien est littéralement devenu l'emblème international de mouvements qui dérivent par voie jusqu'à vouloir renverser des gouvernements démocratiquement élus. Le premier ministre réalise-t-il que sa réaction à l'occupation de sa capitale...
Honorable ministre.
Monsieur le Président, je tiens à remercier mon collègue de souligner l'anniversaire de l'unifolié, notre drapeau qui nous unit tous et chacun. Monsieur le Président, en particulier les fiers députés du Québec, du côté du gouvernement, qui sont de fiers Canadiens également, mais aussi de fiers Canadiens de l'autre côté, Monsieur le Président. Et je pense que c'est important qu'on prenne ce temps-là. Je tiens à remercier mon collègue. Merci beaucoup de l'avoir souligné, Monsieur le Président, pour qu'on puisse tous célébrer ensemble l'anniversaire de l'unifolié.
Honorable député de Montarville.
Monsieur le Président, la réaction mièvre du gouvernement jusqu'à présent a fait en sorte que non seulement c'est la risée internationale, mais une incitation internationale planétaire au désordre. Questionnée hier quand elle est faite de la crise sur la réputation internationale du Canada, justement, le premier ministre a répondu qu'à son avis, le point tournant a été le blocus du pont Ambassadeur. Mais le point tournant, c'est plutôt lorsque les occupants ont assiégé la capitale de son pays sans susciter la moindre réaction de sa part. Après 19 jours d'inaction, il annonce vouloir recourir à l'arme nucléaire, des dispositions législatives, les mesures d'urgence. Comment est-ce possible d'être à ce point...
L'honorable ministre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puisque nous sommes encore en train de parler de l'unifolié, je pense que c'est important de dire ce qu'il représente, ce qu'il symbolise à l'échelle de la planète. Cette fierté, non seulement pour nous d'être Canadiens, mais le rôle que le Canada a joué à travers l'histoire dans la résolution de conflits, dans l'aide publique au développement. Cette main tendue que tous les Canadiens, incluant les Québécois, ont par réflexe, Monsieur le Président, de faire en sorte, encore une fois, Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon collègue de nous rappeler que c'est important de souligner, de célébrer l'unifolié.
The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, for weeks, Canadians looking for hope have been looking for a Prime Minister to listen to their concerns and listen to their needs as the rest of the world opened up. Instead, they heard from a Prime Minister with an escalating tone that left them feeling traumatized, stigmatized, and divided. Even today, he's calling out and blaming other parties who have been listening instead of pitting Canadian versus Canadian and showing real leadership. Yep. Why do Canadians have to pay with their freedoms to cover up for this government's failed leadership?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have different definitions of division. To me, when critical infrastructure is being blocked, when illegal protesters are outside, when we see swastikas and Confederate flags going out and taking photographs and giving coffee, I don't think that's healthy for the country, Mr. Speaker. Instead, what I think would be healthy is to say to those that would seek to divide us, those that would seek to exploit our differences, to say those kinds of radical views do not have a place in this country. It's time to go home. It's time to end this illegal activity, and it's time to come together as a country.
The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, Minipoa.
Mr. Speaker, I sent out a survey last month asking my constituents what was their biggest concerns. The cost of living was the #1 issue. One of my constituents, named Rick, wrote to me and stated, "The food prices are out of my pay range." Mr. Speaker, inflation is at record highs due to this Liberal government's spending. So what does the Prime Minister have to say to Rick, who can't afford to put food on his table?
Good question. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, our government absolutely understands that affordability matters for Canadian families, and that's why we are there for them. We lowered taxes for the middle class and raised them on the wealthiest 1%. We created the Canada Child Benefit, which is indexed to inflation, and now a single mother with 2 children can receive up to $13,600 from the CCB. The Climate Action Incentive gives the average family in Alberta $981, in Saskatchewan $961, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of COVID, all the parties came together to support relief programs for Canadians and businesses. Now the economy is opening up, but the government's money printing press is still humming. Experts are now warning this government what members of this side of the House have been warning for some time, that this government's future spending plan will lead to more inflation. Mr. Speaker, let's give the minister one last chance. When will this government rein in its out-of-control spending?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I pointed out a moment ago, it is actually the members opposite, the members of the party of flip-flops, who campaigned on a platform which proposed higher spending in this fiscal year than we proposed. So let's remind Canadians of that. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting small business, it was this party, contrary to what the member just asserted, that opposed the essential support small businesses needed that we proposed before Christmas.
The honourable member for Vancouver, Granville.
Monsieur le Président, les parents de ma circonscription comprennent que l'inscription de leurs enfants à des programmes d'immersion en français les enrichit culturellement et leur donne un avantage plus tard dans la vie. Cependant, en raison de la pénurie d'enseignants et des longues listes d'attente, il est souvent difficile de s'inscrire à l'immersion française. La ministre des langues officielles pourrait-elle dire à la Chambre comment notre gouvernement donne à plus d'enfants la possibilité d'apprendre le français?
Honorable ministre des langues officielles.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à remercier mon ami et mon collègue de Vancouver-Granville pour son excellente question. Notre gouvernement reconnaît qu'offrir l'opportunité d'apprentissage en français aujourd'hui signifie d'avoir plus d'adultes bilingues dans l'avenir. Dans le budget 2021, nous investissons dans l'élimination des listes d'attente et nous travaillons avec nos partenaires des provinces et des territoires pour continuer à améliorer l'accès de la langue française. Nous allons continuer à travailler avec les communautés, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
The honourable member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Today, more fishermen have been lost at sea, and our hearts go out to them. Captains know the risk of sinking while fishing. What Adam Newell wasn't counting on was losing his vessel while tied up at a DFO wharf. Adam saw his vessel smash into the rocks tied to that wharf. DFO wharfs are falling into the ocean. Adam would not have lost his vessel if the government had not ignored 4 Fishery Committee reports of this House. When will the government act so more vessels are not lost tied up at the wharf? Without wharfs, we can't fish.
The Honourable Minister for Fisheries.
Speaker.
90% of Canadian seafood goes through small craft harbours, and Canada's fish harvesters depend on these facilities to support their livelihoods. And so that's why in Budget 2021, we allocated $300 million to repair and replace these wharves over the next 2 years. We're working to make sure that communities have the harbours that they need and that they're in good repair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Le député de Montmagny-Listec, Kamouraska-Rivière-du-Loup.
Monsieur le Président, la famille Furbaco, composée de 3 futurs citoyens dans mon comté, attendent depuis des mois pour des cartes de résidence permanente. Alors que d'autres demandeurs passent avant eux, les délais interminables dépassent maintenant 180 jours vécus par les Furbaco, font en sorte qu'ils sont incapables de renouveler leur carte d'assurance maladie au Québec, malgré le fait qu'ils travaillent et paient des impôts ici. Est-ce que le gouvernement trouve ça normal? Première question. Deuxième question, qu'en va-t-il faire pour régler le problème?
Le ministre.
Je remercie mon collègue, Monsieur le Président, pour sa question. Écoutez, permettez-moi de souligner certains des progrès qui ont déjà été réalisés. Nous avons retourné à un délai de 12 mois pour les demandes de parrainage de conjoints. On a traité plus de 500 000 nouvelles demandes de permis d'études, soit une augmentation de 32 de notre production. Ce n'est pas un secret que les fermetures liées à la pandémie dans le monde ont eu un impact sur notre système d'immigration, mais nous continuons d'investir dans la modernisation de notre système afin d'avoir un système plus résilient qui continue de soutenir nos objectifs d'accueillir plus de nouveaux résidents qui soutiennent...
Honourable member for Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I asked this government if it was their intent to place public health policy in direct conflict with immigration legislation. Once their working permits expire after February 28th, some guest workers are trapped in Canada without status, separated from their family, separated from work. The Minister of Immigration's response made it clear that this government had no apparent idea of this policy conflict. When will this Liberal government treat innocent people fairly, humanely, and respect them and fix this Liberal fiasco?
That's right.
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the member for his question. And as always, our commitment in modernizing our immigration system is relevant. I was very happy to see that our government invested $85 million in improving our immigration system. And Mr. Speaker, we are more than happy to say to you, as we talk about some of the success of 2021, that we welcome more than 405,000 new permanent residents last year. We are welcoming more skilled workers and international students. You know, Mr. Speaker, we need to do better, and we're continuing to do.
Member for Northwest Territories.
Mr. Speaker, the Gladue principles in part recognize that there's overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, and that there are complex issues based on systemic discrimination which should be considered in sentencing. They now have been used in the courts and sentencing for quite some time. However, in the final report of the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls...
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Oui, un appel au règlement, l'honorable député de Manicouagan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. L'interprète signale que le son est trop de mauvaise qualité pour faire une interprétation.
I'm sorry, this is something that comes up often, and I understand there has been some accommodation made. I'm going to have to talk with our technical folks so that we can make it so that the honourable member... I'm going to ask the honourable... Excuse me. You can interrupt each other, but when you interrupt the speaker, you don't want to get him upset. The honourable member for Northwest Territories, does he have a headset there that he can use? I'll come back to him for a question, just for the microphone. I understand there's some problems with the hearing, but with the microphone, that would be the only way to get the interpretation. Otherwise, we're going to miss half the question, and that's not really good for anyone, not for the member, nor for those here. I'm sorry, but we're not getting interpretation on that microphone. It's a technical issue. What I'll do is I'll go to the next question, and maybe we'll see if we can get that resolved for the next one. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Major General Fraser said Canada pulled out of Afghanistan way too early and 10,000 Afghan interpreters and their families have been left behind. He also said the Liberals failed to provide a whole-of-government plan to help resettle them. While our allies are on the ground helping Afghans get to safety, this government is sending emails telling Afghans to somehow get to a third country on their own. As the situation gets worse, this government still hasn't provided exemptions so NGOs can get aid to starving children. When will the Liberals act with the urgency that the situation demands to help bring Afghans to safety?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada remains firm in its commitment to welcome 40,000 Afghan refugees in Canada. We are sparing no efforts to resettle Afghan refugees as quickly as we can. And I am happy to report that more than 7,500 Afghan refugees have begun their new lives here in Canada overcoming extreme challenges. And we are welcoming new arrival every week. We will continue to do everything we can to show leadership in the face of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan.
Well, member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, when it comes to assessing the Prime Minister's credibility on the climate crisis, the truth is found in the lobbying registry. Because over the last 2 years, his government rolled out the red carpet for big oil with over 370 meetings. No wonder big oil isn't sweating his promise of a tough emissions cap. In fact, they told our committee they plan to vastly increase production, and that position is backed by the energy regulator. So, to the Environment Minister, what kind of credible cap is there that includes massive increases in oil exports?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for his question, and I've asked him that before, and he still hasn't answered. But I would like him to show me a country in the world that has done more in the last 4 or 5 years than we have to fight climate change. More than 100 measures, $100 billion of investment, regulations on methane, clean fuel standards, electricity. These are all things we're doing, and we have so much more to do, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
L'honorable député de Longueuil, Charles Lemoine.
Mr. Speaker, the Gladue principles in part recognize that there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system and that here are complex issues based on systemic discrimination which should be considered in sentencing. They now have to be used in courts and sentencing for quite some time. However, in the final report of the National Inquiry of Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, many participants expressed concerns about over-lenient sentences in cases of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Does the Minister of Justice have an answer to those worried about the Gladue principles negatively impacting the safety and justice for Indigenous women and girls?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank the honourable member for asking that question in the stead of the honourable member from the Northwest Territories, and I thank him for his leadership and his wisdom, Mr. Speaker. The Gladue principles, just like the revitalization of Indigenous justice systems, calls to action from the TRC, the implementation plan for the MMIWG, are concrete steps towards making our justice system fairer. But we understand, Mr. Speaker, there are still systemic issues in our criminal justice system that we need to address. It's impossible to undo centuries of colonialism in only a few short years. Mr. Speaker, far too many women and girls endure serious injustice, including discrimination and disproportionately high rates of violence. We're going to work on this with Indigenous leadership, Mr. Speaker, to get...
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui. Rising on a point of order, I believe the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Arising out of question period, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to table the 4 House of Commons Fishery Committee reports that this Liberal government has not responded to on small craft harbors.